Welcome to The Adjusted Reality, a podcast series trusted by the adjusted and brought to you by the Foundation for Chiropractic Progress, where we learn from athletes, celebrities, influencers, and healthcare professionals about how to optimize health in a fun, relatable way. Join me, Dr. Sherry McAllister, as I speak to Dr. Heidi Haavik about the brain and how it plays a role in your health. Dr. Heidi Haavik is a PhD in human neurophysiology from the University of Auckland. She is the author of the best-selling book, The Reality Check, a quest to understand what happens in the brain as it relates to the spine. She also has and runs a company with the mission of enlightening the world about the science of chiropractic, which you can learn more about at therealitycheck.com. Now, it's such a pleasure to introduce Dr. Heidi Haavik to our podcast today. I know you're in a different place than I am. I'm in the United States, and you're currently, am I right, in New Zealand?
Yes.
Fantastic.
Yes,
so this is early morning for you. Welcome. For many of our listeners today, they come from different walks of life. Some are really trying to optimize their health, while others are actually suffering with chronic pain. So we want to engage both of those audiences today. Could you share a little bit first about the science behind the brain and how maybe it interprets pain?
It's a really interesting topic, Sherry. I've been a neuroscientist now for 20 years, and so I've been going to neuroscience conferences, and the understanding of what pain is has changed dramatically, and I don't think this new understanding has quite gotten through to the public yet. It often sits with scientists for a while, and we debate and argue about it, and then it eventually trickles into textbooks and you start to learn it from a public perspective. And what's showing up, which is really fascinating, is that a lot of chronic pain problems are actually a learned problem within the brain itself. And that's not to say that they are making it up or faking it in any way. It's a real problem, but it's a brain problem more than it is a tissue pathology problem. So what we mean by that is if someone's had, say, low back pain for 10 years or even 6 months, by then it can be a problem with the way the brain is interpreting what's going on in the spine more than there is a problem with the spine itself. So this is really quite fascinating because a lot of the public still think if they've got low back pain, it's a low back problem. And what we're understanding now is that it actually can be far more of a brain problem, and we almost need to try and train the brain out of pain. And this is where it gets kind of fascinating because there's quite a few quite cool things that we can do to train the brain out of pain. But I don't know if that's enough of an explanation, because people might be sitting there scratching their heads going, what do you mean it's a brain problem?
How do I train my brain? You know, that this is a beautiful place to start, actually, is training the brain and really changing the way people look at things, so the things they look at change. That's a big part of adjusted reality. And I'd like for you to kind of go over a lot of what you do in research over the years of your own clinical experience. Tell us a little bit about maybe how you can improve your brain for health rather than being in pain and sickness. So talk to us a little bit about maybe, how do I get my brain working? How do I train my brain, Dr. Heidi?
I didn't even really start looking at the pain literature because it wasn't what I was interested in. I was really interested in, why does the spine matter so much? Because in my background too, I'm also a chiropractor, and I had been taking care of patients, and I could see these dramatic changes in some people and others it took a bit more time, and I couldn't understand how could the spine have such a profound impact, because as you know too, people get adjusted by chiropractors and they can have all kinds of improvements, and this can be in the way they feel and the way they can cope with stress and the way they sleep. And so I was interested in, how is this possible? How can the spine influence all these different things? So I started studying human neurophysiology, and we started doing experiments looking at how does changing spinal function change brain function. And this is when I started to realize that the way I even understood how the brain interprets the world is slightly different than what I realized. Like, the brain will get a lot of sensory information, and it gets that information from the world around you, like from your eyes and ears and taste buds. and touch on the skin, but it also gets a lot of sensory information from inside your body. So that's about your temperature and the chemistry and your organs and what's going on inside your body. And then all of this gets mushed together. That's the best words I can use to explain. It literally gets integrated together, but surprisingly, it also uses your thoughts and your feelings and your past experiences. So for example, someone that's experienced a lot of stress, they will actually interpret the sensory information that their brain receives differently than someone who hasn't been under a lot of stress. So it's started to get really fascinating that the way our brains create our own reality is it's a bit like a virtual reality. If there's older people in the audience who watched that movie, The Matrix,
right?
With the computer programmer that then goes off and wants to take either the red pill or the blue pill to find out what the Matrix is, and he finds out that he's lived his entire life in a dream. He's been hooked up to a supercomputer. It's almost the same thing for us, but it's not quite so bad. We're not hooked up to a supercomputer. Our brain is the supercomputer. So the brain takes in all the sensory information. It considers your past experiences and what you're expecting from your future. But we know that what you expect will happen actually influences your current reality. So this integration, I think, is far more powerful than we actually realize. So again, just take an example of someone coming to see you, and they're complaining that they've got maybe elbow pain, and they've had elbow pain for more than 3 months, then it's considered chronic pain. They may have nothing wrong with their elbow now. That's the really interesting thing. May have started with a little accident and they knocked their elbow, but from there, all sorts of computations can have taken place. And the brain literally learns to be in chronic pain, just like it learns anything else, like learning how to ride a bike or play the piano. You learn to be in chronic pain. So this is, again, when it got really interesting, because now, of course, I was interested in finding out, well, what can you do to unlearn these problems? And here there's some cool stuff. A lot of it is probably common knowledge or common sense to most people, in that we exercise. Movement is incredibly powerful, even as little as a short walk every day. So if you are in chronic pain, I would highly recommend, I wouldn't suddenly go run marathons, like there's just do little steps. But if you're not exercising and you are in chronic pain, I would definitely start moving, even if that was just once around the block every day, and just start pushing that a little bit. Another thing that's extremely important is the microbiome and the gut. When I've been going to these neuroscience conferences, Sherry, for the last 20 years, and you wouldn't find anything about the gut or the microbiome 20 years ago. I mean, that would be considered something for the gastroenterology people, not for us neuroscientists. But now we recognize that there's more neurons in your gut than there is in your spinal cord. So your stomach, your gut, your intestines, it's literally considered the second brain. And it has an incredible impact on brain health, the gut, the microbiome. So I don't know if you guys know about probiotics and looking after gut health. There can be a lot of bad bacteria that grow there, especially if you've been on antibiotics. So if this is you've been on antibiotics, and this kind of coincides with you developing a lot of problems, I would highly recommend going to see someone to get some help with your gut and your microbiome. Because if you've got an unhealthy microbiome, we know it's very detrimental to brain health and to health in general. So there's two things. There's exercise and there's the gut. We also know that, like mindfulness meditation, so having a calm mind, being present in your body, and this is easier to talk about than it is to do.
Sure.
I read books and books about this before I actually ever managed to meditate. And I had to force myself to do 10 minutes a day. And that's just 10 minutes a day. But if you like me and you never meditated, and I'm quite highly strung as well. So if you worry a lot and you get stressed, again, I mean, meditation, I can't recommend it enough. And this is according to the literature. I've been reading the literature on this. So there's 3 things, and I can keep going, because sleep, getting good sleep. We literally know now that when you get into deep sleep, it's like the dishwasher going for your brain. So it's literally, it cleans the brain, but only when you get into deep sleep. So if you're not able to get into deep sleep, your brain isn't being cleaned. It's the fluid isn't being washed around. So you're not detoxing all the toxic chemicals that end up being build up in the fluids that surrounds the brain to protect the brain. So that's a big thing, because a lot of people are, especially people in pain, they struggle to sleep, and often they are very stressed. So you're talking, it sort of becomes like 1,000 straws on the camel's back, and it sort of collapses, and you end up in pain. But the fascinating thing, again, I'm going slightly sidetracked here, Sherry. You're going to have to sort of reel me in if I go off on tangents.
I love what you're saying so far. Keep going with it.
Well, what we know now is the pain system. So the feelings of pain, they're actually considered danger warning signals. We used to think that they were tissue pathology signals, that, okay, if you've injured your elbow, you're going to feel pain to sort of protect and heal the elbow. But now we know that you don't actually have to have tissue pathology. So for example, fear or loneliness or anxiety or stress, those signals alone can activate the danger warning system, and you can feel pain. So this is when it gets kind of interesting, because that mindfulness, that calming the brain down is really key to this. Being able to sleep, to dishwash, to clean the brain is really key to this. Another thing about the microbiome is your diet. So what you eat influences your diet. It's probably the biggest impactor of your microbiome is the diet that you eat. So eating fresh, healthy fruit and vegetables promotes the gut. Fermented foods like yogurts and things like that, again, they feed the gut. And taking the probiotic supplements, and even taking prebiotics, which feed the good bacteria that are supposed to be in the gut. These are all brilliant things to help the overall function of the brain. And then surprisingly, probably to a lot of people, is the movement of your spine. And this is probably why chiropractic has been so successful with their patients, is because that movement of the spine is so impactful for how the brain perceives what's going on.
Right.
And this is my area where I've just, it's blown my mind. Like, we've done studies, Sherry, where we've seen adjusting spines, so just getting that little movement into the spine, which is, you know, it's a very short, little tiny movement, but it's very fast. When we get that little movement into the spine, it even changes the way your brain perceives what you see and hear. So it influences what you see and hear. I mean, that to me still boggles my mind. It suddenly makes sense now. A whole lot of things that I used to see in practice, you know, way back when I actually was a practicing chiropractor and not a full-time scientist, because it's like we change the entire reality of the person. And this is probably why we can so magically switch pain off, because we're actually directly affecting the brain. And we even know we're affecting the part of the brain that is part of what is known as the pain matrix. So there's certain parts of the brain that light up when the danger warning system is activated and we feel pain. And one key component of that is this part of the brain just behind your forehead called the prefrontal cortex. And so when we again adjust the spine, we change the processing in that part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And that is probably why chiropractic care is so incredibly good at turning pain off or reducing pain, because we're actually getting to the problem that's been developing in the brain itself when we're talking about chronic pain problems.
That in and of itself, just talking about the impact that an adjustment can make to the prefrontal cortex, is probably something that's resonating with our listeners right now and thinking, how did I not know that? I mean, that is how my spine is related to my brain, because a lot of what we talk about is not that. We try to disassociate the two from one another, but in fact, they are one. Interesting that you put it in a way that I think is very relatable. I see the dishwasher cycle going off at sleep at night. I see that we have a refrigerator called the brain that hosts a lot of the good stuff that the body's going to need. And that's the food that is going to be necessary to carry out activities of daily living and really optimizing how you perform. We all know when we eat a bunch of sugar, how great we feel right after. And then all of a sudden everything changes. And then our pain, if we've had some pain in the past, it might dip up a little bit. But then you said something that I think is really important for our listeners to really focus on. And that is the gut, and how the gut itself becomes the second brain. So I kind of see that as the oven. It's cooking the food to give to the brain, and the three cycles work together, because I think sleep is an impressively important aspect of our lives. And so many of us around the globe right now are suffering with severe stress in the positions that we've been put in. We've been struck with a pandemic, and we're still working our way through it. So the stress level.
Can I
Yes,
touch on that? Because
please
it's
do.
another one of those really big topics that has actually, it's been really surprising to me, again, as a neuroscientist, a brain scientist, going to these conferences for over 20 years now, neuroscience conferences, stuff relating to stress, stuff relating to emotional trauma, it was never talked about 20 years ago. It was kind of relegated. That was the psychology department.
Sure.
Nothing to do with us brain scientists. But now, like the last neuroscience conference that I went to in Chicago last year, when we could actually go to conferences, it was like 30,000 neuroscientists there. There's so many topics and so many presentations that before the event, you have to decide what you're going to go to. I literally could have spent my entire 5 days running from presentation to presentation and only gone to topics that related to trauma and emotional stress. This has been an explosion in our understanding. And again, I'm not sure this has completely gotten through to the public yet, just how important the stress is on our health. We now know that there is this stress continuum. So
Sure.
if you first have a stressful experience, and what I mean by that, because some people think that they're not stressed, but it's not what you emotionally feel is stressful, it's what your brain interprets as a danger. So if your brain interprets that you experience something that's dangerous, what happens is you release all these chemicals in your brain that actually turns the prefrontal cortex off. So I'll get back to that because it's an interesting one. They talk about the brain model. Dan Siegel is a phenomenal psychologist, and he's got this little brain hand model. These fingers here is your cortex, your prefrontal cortex is behind your forehead. Underneath them is your limbic brain, that's your emotional brain. And then your wrist is your brain stem and your breathing, heart rate, digestion kind of control. But your emotional limbic brain, and there's your prefrontal cortex. When you experience stress, it flips off, and that's actually probably not the best way to explain this to Americans, but it turns off the prefrontal cortex. So it literally, there's a dump of neurochemicals that into the prefrontal cortex and turns it off. So you go into your emotional brain, or what's called an emotional storm. And anyone who's experienced going into this fight and flight response will know what I'm talking about. You get emotional, you can be tearful, angry, fearful, crying. Your rational brain is your prefrontal cortex. So that's been turned off. So you can't think clearly. You can't think rationally. It's why you sometimes can't remember what happened to you, because you've gone into this emotional limbic brain where there is no time, logical reasoning. You're basically a tantruming 2-year-old, but it's a fear response and it's a protective response for us. The thing is, what's really fascinating is if you've experienced one of these stressful events, what happens is that it changes your brain from that day onwards. So anything now after that day, after that experience, anything that even vaguely reminds you of that stressful experience will again turn off the prefrontal cortex. So say, for example, just to make it a little bit more real, say you were abused as a child, you had a traumatic childhood, something happened to you as a kid. From that day on, it's changed your brain. Mm-hmm. And say anything that reminds that child as they're growing up about their trauma, which could be on a regular basis. It could just be that any man frightens them, or any dark-haired man frightens them, or a belt frightens them, or whatever it is that happened to them triggers their brain to remember the trauma, keeps turning off the prefrontal cortex. What we know happens to their body because of this change in the brain is that they start to get an increase in inflammation. And not just inflammation, they start to get problems relaxing. Because that prefrontal cortex is very important to turn on our parasympathetic nervous system. That's your healing, digesting, relaxing, reproduction nervous system. So that healing nervous system keeps getting turned off. And so that's kind of key to this. But the sympathetic nervous system, which is kind of like your stress nervous system, gets turned on. So you kind of get stuck in this fight and flight response. And what happens over time is you struggle to relax, you struggle to sleep, you struggle to to heal. It's difficult to concentrate. So often these kids can get trouble focusing at school and paying attention because they need their rational, logical thinking brain. But if it's always on fight and flight mode, it won't be working. So you can sort of see how this builds up. Over years, we know that this increase in inflammation is now linked with a whole host of diseases and disorders. There's actually a phase in between as well where they start to get these silent secondary symptoms, which are things like high blood pressure, high cholesterol levels, insulin resistance, all of these metabolic disorders. And then if it goes on for long enough without them getting any help, it turns into frank diseases. So we know, based on so much research, that if you have high inflammatory levels, like really high inflammatory levels, it is always present in people with coronary artery diseases, heart attacks and strokes, neurological problems, cancers, autoimmune diseases, neurological problems, Crohn's, arthritis, chronic pain, mental health. All of mental health disorders go hand in hand with this kind of long-term stress as well. So it's really quite scary and quite sad just how dramatically detrimental stressful events are. And you think of what's going on around the world today. You brought that up. I mean, that's going to compound what's going on for people when it comes to stress levels and not being able to earn money, not being able to feed your families. I mean, it's compounding and compounding. But the negative health impacts this has, we're going to see it. We're going to see it come in the next, 10 years. We're going to see an explosion in a lot of these very bad stress-related illnesses.
So, Dr. Heidi, you are definitely on track to something that I think a lot of the listeners today are questioning is, you're right, I've had these traumatic problems, whether it be an injury or something happened.
Like 9 out of 10 Americans, you read surveys, 9 out of 10 Americans have experienced something traumatic. And I would imagine that right now that's gone up quite significantly.
So now, as you say that, I know our listeners want to be proactive. They want to be, how do I start to even contemplate? Some of these stresses happened so long ago that I don't even know they're with me anymore, but I can see what you're saying could be true. Is my stomach's upset? Because I know a lot of people, when they get stressed, such as myself, I can feel it in my stomach before I feel it anywhere else. Is that there's a piece of me that just doesn't feel right.
Again, it comes down to that prefrontal cortex being turned off, because the prefrontal cortex activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is your healing, digesting, reproducing, so that digestion, the functional gastrointestinal problems often come from the stress, from turning off the prefrontal cortex, disabling your ability to turn on your healing, digesting nervous system. So it goes hand in hand.
So you've given us some very powerful tools so far. One being watch what you eat. Two being get some exercise. And Dr. Heidi, in your research today, is there a specific amount of exercise that really gives you the maximum? Is there a specific type of exercise that you would recommend to them?
If you've been under a lot of stress, so if you know that stress from your past, like I know I've got traumatic experiences in my past. I mean, I've done a lot of work with psychologists about this. And again, it's something that I'd highly recommend, finding a really good therapist, because sometimes they can help you change the way your brain is, it's called reframing. So you kind of change the way the trauma is currently affecting you now. It's really interesting. Like, I mean, I remember, say, for example, when I was 5, I moved from England to Norway. So I couldn't speak Norwegian. So it was extremely traumatic for a 5-year-old girl that got put in school. No one spoke to her, right? But I've now managed to reframe that, because my panic and fear about not being understood and therefore being isolated and alone and very unhappy, it's turned into me being very good at translating research findings, because I had this innate fear that people didn't understand my scientific language. So I had to translate it. But now it's become one of my greatest skills, is I'm a very good translator of science, because I had that trauma. So when I'm reminded of that now, my brain doesn't go and turn the prefrontal cortex off. It actually goes, oh yes, that's why we're so good at being able to translate science. So that's the kind of thing that you can work with a good therapist about. But you were asking me about exercise, and I wanted to get at, if it relates to stress and trauma, like if you know you've had stress and trauma in your life, then there are a few things I would recommend. And with the amount of exercise, I would go a little bit more than you're currently doing.
Mhm.
So if you're currently not doing any exercise, then I would recommend maybe walking for 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers every day. So I'm literally talking 20 minutes, 30 minutes max, and it could just be literally around your block. But for some people, that could be too much. You might need to walk on the flat if there's too many hills around you. There's also some exercise, but like say if you are already doing quite a bit of exercise, have a little think about what kind of exercise you're doing. Because if your brain is very stressed and you're doing fighting kinds of exercise, it might not be so smart because, you know, like things like I used to do taekwondo and I was actually quite good at it, but I was young and I wasn't as stressed out as I am now. I probably wouldn't do it now because it is a fighting. And once you're fighting,
Right.
it's activating the fight and flight systems. So boxing, it's again a fight and flight response for your brain. So you just got to kind of think a little bit about the kinds of exercise that you're doing, that it's not going to be activating the stress response. You can actually monitor this, and there are apps out there, some really good apps on iPhones and or smartphones like Welltory, Welltory, and it monitors what's called heart rate variability. I don't know if you want to go down that track, but it's actually a really good way to monitor how well you're doing and if you're overdoing it. Like some people think, oh, exercise is great, I've got to do exercise, and then they go out and start doing hour-long fitness exercises, and they just drain their body of whatever energy they've got left, and it doesn't help them. It
Right.
actually makes it worse. So, you know, you just want to be doing a little bit more than what you're currently doing, because even exercising is considered stressful for the body. So, which is, there's a difference between good stress and bad stress. So you kind of want to get the good stress in there, but again, not overdo it, because then again, it's detrimental.
I really like your warning on that, because I do see people that hear about something and then they want to get into these high intensity impact workouts. And before I know it, they're more stressed out than when they started their programs. And we just need to take that small step into finding it and being able to recognize that there are a variety of different ways to find peace. And you brought up one of them, meditation, and being able to be respectful to your body. I have had several incidences with patients going into the Ironman type of activity, and that does put a lot of strain and stress into the body, and is mental and physical, that can come out of it. Tell me, Dr. Heidi, you wrote a book called The Reality Check. What was the reason for this book to be implemented, and what did you learn after writing it and showcasing it around the world?
It was, it came back to my stress as a 5-year-old, not being, being understood
There
at
we
school.
go.
Yeah, no, seriously, Sherry, I've been teaching neuroscience and research methodology and this sort of stuff at the New Zealand College of Chiropractic for many, many years, since 2006. And what I realized is that my students weren't really understanding me. And you know, I know some lecturers wouldn't really care and they just do their thing, but to me this was like traumatic
Sure.
until I worked through, you know, what I've been working through. But so every year I try to improve it and I try to improve it, and I realized that I've been in this science world for, you know, 8 years at that stage, and so of course they wouldn't really understand what I was talking about because I was speaking a different language, which was very much my Norwegian English thing. So over the years I suddenly realized, you know, I'd gotten it to a level that they understood me, and I was delighted. And I knew that because I asked open-ended questions, not multiple choice. They had to actually write out the answers to my exam questions. So I knew they understood what I was teaching them. But then I noticed that they weren't able to explain it. So they weren't able to explain it to the patients they were seeing in the student health center. So this is when I realized I needed to write the book, because although some chiropractors and some students were understanding the research and what it meant, they weren't able to explain it. And that wasn't good enough to me, because there are people out there that don't realize the benefits that they could get from chiropractic care. And I don't mean just 1 or 2 visits. I mean getting adjusted, you know, on a reasonably regular basis. It has a tremendous impact on how the brain perceives what's going on inside the body and the world around you. So I needed to get this information across to my students, across to chiropractors all around the world, so that they could share this with the public. Because again, back in the days when I was a practicing chiropractor, I used to get families come in crying because they'd given me their baby back. You know, that's kind of
Mm.
what they were saying that to me. You've given me my baby back. I mean, I've got a real baby now, and not a screaming, crying thing that just tore our hearts out. And they would literally be in tears. And I mean, the mums, the dads, you know, sometimes the extended family. So this chiropractic thing, it's bigger than most people realize. And it would sort of just break my heart. They'd say, why isn't this available to all children? Why isn't this available to all people? And I'm going, I think through a lot of ignorance. And this is, again, partly why I was so interested in understanding exactly how does this thing work? How does it work? And then can we get that across to people? So that's why I ended up in 2013, I think the Christmas 2013-14. At that stage, I'd met this wonderful man in my life. and he had this concept, this strange concept about us having to take breaks and have holidays. I'm like, that just didn't exist in my world at that stage. At that stage, I'd raised 2 children, done a PhD, practicing as a chiropractor. I was way too busy to have holidays. But anyway, he was insisting we take breaks. But he got a little bit distracted. His mother wasn't well that particular Christmas. And so in that time period, I literally wrote the book, literally over a couple of weeks. It just all came out because at that stage I'd been working on this, and I literally wrote the language with which I would explain it to my then 93-year-old grandmother so that she could understand exactly the work that I'd been doing for the last 10 years and what it meant to someone like her. Interestingly enough, her father was one of the first 1,000 chiropractors ever to graduate from the first chiropractic college in the world. So she was already hooked on chiropractic, but she still didn't understand how it worked because most of us didn't know. But so that's how I wrote it and why I wrote it. But I was not prepared for the overwhelming response worldwide. That took me by surprise.
Well, that Heidi, I think one of the key components is taking away is that there are different ways now that the brain is being relegated to the consumer. Is how does the brain impact their daily living, and how does what you do have impact on how your brain perceives it? That's kind of a critical component. And I think I can sincerely agree with you that as the more the consumer knows about how the brain works, and the more they know about their own ability to take control of that, like we were talking about, and the several ways that you have graciously given of the keys that will really, just getting off this podcast, implement easily into their lifestyle, I think is so critically important, and why the Adjusted Reality podcast exists, is to be able to inform our consumers about the impact they can make and how to optimize their health. Well, I can't thank you enough, Dr. Heidi, for joining us today. I know our listeners got a lot to walk away with, and we just feel blessed, and we hope that you will join us again.
I'd love to. There's a whole lot of little tricks as well, or little experiments that people can do themselves just to test if their spine's working okay. Yeah, there's a whole lot of things that we could talk about that would be really interesting.
Well, I think we got a take 2 with Dr. Heidi Haavik to come on back and make sure that we can start instigating opportunities for optimizing our health. So now I think I got you pegged down that we're going to have a part 2 to this one, Doctor, and we'll be able to help them move these other pieces for their life into play. So thank you very, very much for joining us today, and we look forward definitely to having you back.
Pleasure.
I want to thank you for tuning in to The Adjusted Reality, a podcast series trusted by the adjusted. As we spoke to Dr. Heidi Haavik about the science behind the brain. This podcast was brought to you by the Foundation for Chiropractic Progress. If you're feeling inspired to learn more about chiropractic or find a doctor of chiropractic near you, visit f4cp.org/findadoctor. Don't forget to subscribe, share the podcast with friends, and rate and review. We appreciate your support and look forward to checking in with you again soon.